Thank you for joining our Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar on the role of clinical trials for cancer patients. Clinical trials are the primary means by which new cancer treatments are developed, tested, and approved. In this webinar, you will learn why a clinical trial may be right for you, understand the different phases of and common terms used in clinical trials, and hear tips on talking to your doctor about your clinical trial options. I am Mary Margaret Kilmeyer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I am the Patient Resource Manager for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and recently completed my doctorate. My clinical and research background is focused on working collaboratively with doctors, patients, their families, and members of a healthcare team. We would like to thank Genentech for providing funding to make this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our promotional partners, the American Association for Cancer Research, the Anti-Cancer Club, Cure Magazine, the Esophageal Cancer Action Network, Meals to Heal, and Patient Resource. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You can type your question into the white text box that appears on your screen. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in approximately 1 week. I will introduce Debbie Zellman, who will share with you her journey and information about Debbie's Dream Foundation. Then our presenter, Dr. Michael Choti, will hold an open forum about clinical trials. We encourage you to send in your questions about clinical trials starting now and throughout the presentation for Dr. Jody to address. I would now like to introduce the President and Founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation, Debbie Zellman.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Hello, everyone. Thank you for those who have stayed tuned from our previous webinar on nutrition. So many of you know that I was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer in April of 2008. At that time, I was 40 years old, the mother of 3 young children, married to a physician, and a practicing attorney with my own firm. I had no risk factors for stomach cancer, and the symptoms I had were very vague. I was told that my chances of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. However, I'm excited to tell you that it has now been over 7 years since my diagnosis, but I do want to point out that I have had 5 recurrences over that 7 years, and I am still a patient. Next slide. About a year after I was diagnosed, I founded Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I'm proud to tell you we are now a member of many coalitions that fight against cancer, including the Deadliest Cancers Coalition, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and One Voice Against Cancer. I'm a patient advocate on many committees, including the National Cancer Institute Esophagogastric Task Force, the Patient Advocacy Steering Committee, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network Gastric and Esophageal Guidelines Committee, the CDMRP Department of Defense Peer Review Cancer Research Program Integration Panel, the American Society for Clinical Oncology HER2 Testing Guidelines and Gastric Cancer Project, and I'm a stakeholder for the American Cancer Society's research program. However, I'm told that most notably, I appeared on Dr. Oz in a program about stomach cancer. Next slide. So some facts again about stomach cancer. Stomach cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, second in men and fourth in women. Each year, approximately 1 million people will be diagnosed worldwide with stomach cancer, and approximately 700,000 will die. More than 24,000 Americans will be diagnosed with stomach cancer each year, and more than 11,000 of those people will die that same year. Stomach cancer is on the rise in young people, ages 25 to 39. However, per cancer death, stomach cancer receives the least amount of federal research funds of any cancer. There were few resources and support services available for patients, and few people knew about this disease. Next slide. So therefore, I started Debbie's Dream Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which was the first in the U.S., dedicated to raising awareness about stomach cancer, advancing funding for research, and providing education and support internationally to patients, families, and caregivers. And our ultimate goal is to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. Our website is debbiesdream.org. Next slide. I'm proud to tell you we have accomplished so much in just 6 short years, including lots of free information and resources. Our Patient Resource Education Program, which is abbreviated PREP, prepares patients, families, and caregivers for this journey they're about to take. Those inquirers from around the world are matched with other stomach cancer survivors and caregivers using specific disease criteria, such as stage, biomarker, age, gender, region, and role. We also offer free symposia and webinars throughout the year, just like this one. We have 27 chapters in the United States, Canada, and Germany, and events across the U.S. and Canada. We have now funded over $300,000 for research. We've also indirectly advanced the funding of research through holding advocacy days and a Capitol Hill briefing. We have had 3 stomach cancer advocacy days, and our 4th one is scheduled in February. I would highly encourage all of you to join us. It is such an effective way to help change the profile and the research funding for stomach cancer. In fact, as a direct result of Demystifying advocacy, we were able to have stomach cancer included in the $50 million pot of money that was given to the Department of Defense through the Peer Reviewed Cancer Research Program. So we are now one of 11 cancers that are eligible to receive that funding. In addition, our website is really in-depth with stomach cancer information, including a lecture library, clinical trials information and matching service, a very unique stomach cancer support community, blog topics and resources, and the website is completely translatable into more than 60 languages. I would highly encourage all of you after this webinar to go onto our website and make sure you register for the support community. It is incredible. I would also urge you to really look through the information and support tab because all of these services and information are available there. Again, demystream.org. Next slide, please. This is a little screenshot of just part of the homepage of our website. It is a really easily navigable site. As I refer to the information and support tab on the top there, there's a lot of information about us. There's information about events as well as news that we are in and ways that you can take action. Of course, also you can shop Demystifying Foundation through the Periwinkle Power part of our website. You can purchase shirts and calendars and note cards, etc. But I'd like to point out the buttons below what we call the rotator. It's so easy to get involved, whether it's to subscribe to our newsletter, to request a mentor, to submit your survivor story. There's lots of ways that we can assist you or that you can get involved. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn the webinar back over to our wonderful moderator, Mary Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. As you can see on your screen, we have many events coming up that are across the country and throughout the year, and we encourage everyone to participate. On September 21st here in Fort Lauderdale, we will be holding our first ever Dream Big luncheon. Also in September, but in Chicago, Illinois, we will have a team participating in the 19th annual half marathon and 5K. And in Chicago, but in November, on November 7th, we will be holding a stomach cancer education symposium. And this event is free for patients, caregivers, their family members, or anyone who would like to participate and learn more. And if you're not able to attend in the Chicago area or get to the Chicago area on November 7th, this event will be live webcast internationally for everyone to log in and view, and not only watch but participate by sending in your questions and comments to the presenters in real time. So we encourage everyone to go over to our events page and register for that as soon as possible. On November 13th, it's International Stomach Cancer Genes Day, and this is a very fun way to raise awareness and support stomach cancer patients, and you can learn more about that also in the events section of our website. In January of 2016, we will hold our Miami Marathon, or rather we will have a team participating in the Miami Marathon and Half Marathon. To learn more about this and other events across the country, please log on to www.demystream.org and visit the events section of our website. Demystifying Foundation is headquartered in Davie, Florida. Our office is open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. On this slide, you will also see important phone numbers and email addresses for you to contact our office. We will start the presentation on demystifying clinical trials, and today, like I said, will be an open forum of questions and answers from Dr. Michael Choti. Dr. Jody received his medical degree at Yale University and completed a surgical oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center before joining the surgical oncology division at Johns Hopkins. And he currently serves as the chair of the Department of Surgery at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Dr. Choti serves in several leadership positions for national and international societies. In addition, he's a principal and co-investigator for a variety of studies examining new approaches for the treatment of cancer, as well as maintaining a laboratory for robotics and computer assistance to surgically treat gastrointestinal malignancies. We are also very proud to have Dr. Choti serve on the Medical Advisory Board of W Stream Foundation. And at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Choti. And we will begin our questions. Dr. Jody, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Yes, Mary Margaret, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have some questions that have already been sent in, and if it's okay, I will go ahead and read our first question.
Well, let me first make some introductory comments, but again, thank you so much for inviting me and all of you for joining the webinar. As you heard, I am a cancer surgeon focusing on abdominal intestinal cancer, including stomach cancer, so I am a surgeon, but also academically involved in clinical trials, which is an important way that we determine the most effective therapies for cancer, and so clinical trials, of course, are just as an introduction, are ways we determine what's best. And trials, of course, can be are studies. It's not just for drug therapy, for chemotherapy or systemic therapy, but also there may be surgical techniques or other forms, radiation therapy, but also even studies to look at the effectiveness of imaging, of testing, of screening, of biomarkers to determine prognosis or predictors of therapy. So, from a broad standpoint, clinical trials are very important. And one point is also that that's important as an individual or a family member dealing with someone with stomach cancer. Hopefully, we'll get some input from some of the questions, but it not only has the advantage of, so I would encourage all of you to, if you have an opportunity to participate in clinical trials. Why is it advantageous? Well, one, the obvious, of course, it helps the community at large moving forward in new discoveries, but also there are advantages to the individual. First of all, you may, through a trial, one may have access to cutting-edge, novel, arguably in some cases not fully proven therapies, but that gives an opportunity for individuals to perhaps, if something is in fact advantageous, then it has an advantage to offer that individual the most cutting-edge therapy. The other advantages, of course, are that often these are done in centers, or if you're participating in such a trial, it's often done in centers and by individuals that have a lot of experience and a lot of training and a lot of the infrastructure for best practice, for best care. So by participating in a trial, or certainly in a center that participates in clinical trials, that will often may reflect opportunity to have the best of care overall. And then also, just by participating in a clinical trial, one has the advantage of having even more attentive follow-up and screening, more attentive follow-up and testing and so forth as part of the clinical trial. So I think those are certainly some of the advantages of participating in a trial, but we can hopefully get into, with some of the questions, some details about the specifics of what different types of trials may be. So why don't I just stop there with the introductory comments, and then perhaps we can move on and see if there are any questions to discuss.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And actually, you referenced one of the questions that we do have regarding possible surgical trials. So if you could speak about what, if any, surgical trials have occurred or are current for GI malignancies or stomach cancer?
There are, and I apologize for not kind of getting the latest update across nationally about if there are any ongoing surgical trials specifically, or the specific portfolio of ongoing clinical trials. But any of these typically can be, depending on whatever center you're at, you can ask about that, about whether there may be any either surgical or other clinical trials that may be available. And then the second is that trials.gov and other NIH sites, and I assume even on the Debbie's Dream site, we can find ways to access specific trials. With regard to surgical trials, as you know, just the current surgical therapy, of course, are typically are not in the context of clinical trials. And in fact, if someone has localized stomach cancer that's operable and potentially curable with surgery, we actually never had a randomized trial demonstrating the efficacy of surgical resection of gastrectomy, for example, versus no gastrectomy, because it just is another example. Everything we do has not been studied in a randomized clinical trial, for example. The argument is made, for example, there's never been a clinical trial demonstrating the efficacy of a parachute if you jump out of a plane, randomizing patients to parachute versus no parachute. Of course, that's a ludicrous example to say that the evidence based on propensity of clinical practice that demonstrates the efficacy of the benefit in most cases of surgery, for example, in localized stomach cancer. So that's an example of when we really haven't studied the efficacy of surgery in general. Saying that, there are a lot of important surgical questions that have been studied in the past, and either in the context of a randomized trial or other forms of clinical trials demonstrating best practice. So, for example, the extent of the amount of stomach that needs to be removed, for example, if a patient has a stomach cancer in, let's say, the proximal stomach or the distal stomach, the extent of lymph node removal, what's called lymphadenectomy. This actually has been a kind of a classic studies done, and there are the extent of lymph node removal in a stomach operation for stomach cancer can be defined either by the number of nodes removed or by the type of lymphadenectomy, the so-called D1 lymphadenectomy, D2 or D3. This stands for the extent of how the different echelons of lymph nodes around, and there have been randomized trials done randomizing patients to so-called D1 versus D2. That is a big lymphadenectomy versus a smaller lymphadenectomy, for example. So that's an example of, and demonstrating that in case that a wider removal of lymph nodes in selected situations is of benefit. And then there are other studies, laparoscopic versus open surgery, and other approaches, as well as, so from a pure surgical standpoint, there have been a variety of questions looking at techniques in a trial. Currently, do I know of any specific trials randomizing to or looking at specific operative techniques? There may be some specific institutional or regional studies going on around the world, but I'm not specifically familiar with a given pure technique. And then, of course, there are other types of trials related to surgery. So, for example, does one give chemotherapy first in a localized stomach cancer versus surgery first, or does one give chemo and radiation and then surgery, or surgery followed by chemo radiation? And there have been different studies in the multimodality therapy of stomach cancer that integrates questions of the timing of surgery, for example, rather than just a surgical technique specifically. But the short answer to your question is, without knowing any specific ongoing surgery-specific trials. Clearly, there have been a variety of areas that have defined best practice in the surgical management of gastric cancer over the last several decades.
So then, thank you for that explanation. And if I'm understanding you then correctly, it sounds that although there can be surgical trials, it's often a review or a historical retrospective of best practices in specific cases that help inform future treatment decisions. Is that?
Yeah, in some such obvious things such as whether to do surgery or not in a localized stomach cancer, there's some obviously recommendations for treatment related to surgery that have never been subjected at all to a formal trial for the obvious reasons, but components of surgical therapy, technique-wise, minimally invasive versus operation, timing, and extent of surgery that have over the years been studied in trials, and that's got us to where we are now. The future, the ongoing with regard to surgical techniques, one is there, which are questions that are currently continuing to be asked. One is, as I mentioned, what's the optimal timing, or whether, or for example, different techniques which may be being studied, perhaps not in a randomized setting in many cases, laparoscopic, minimally invasive technique versus standard extent of surgery, robotic versus non-robotic, things like that. It may be in the future that as we develop more and more effective systemic therapies or even radiation therapy, we may in the future be re-asking the question whether we need to do surgery. So while I emphasize that it's, in many cases without a randomized trial, it's obvious, and in localized stomach cancer that surgical therapy must be part of the treatment. You can envision in not too near future, not too long from now, that if we develop effective therapies that can cause the tumor to go away, then one might not need surgery. So for example, in esophageal cancer, not so much stomach cancer, specific types like squamous cell cancers of the esophagus, where not so much adenocarcinoma, where now some of the therapies may be so effective as to eliminating the tumor that at least some are addressing questions as to whether one needs to, if the tumor completely goes away with chemotherapy or with chemoradiation therapy, for example, does surgery even need to be done? We're definitely not there for localized stomach cancer, for contained stomach cancer. That is still, most of the time, we think that surgical removal of the primary tumor in non-metastatic stomach cancer, but surgical removal of the primary tumor and or lymphadenectomy is still a very critical part of the treatment.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions specific to drug trials, so I'd like to see if you could explain the differences between from trials for PD-1, PD-L1, and PIK3CA. Do you have any information about those trials or types of trials for that?
Well, those are, of course, those are new agents that have that are related to immunotherapy, to integrate, and so this is an exciting area of studies going on throughout the cancer world with regard to the use of immune modulation in order to as effective treatments. I must say, I apologize, I don't know the specifics of which centers are performing or whether they're ongoing cooperative trials in this area, but I again would refer you to the sites to know the details of those trials, but they are being certainly integrated, including in combination with standard cytotoxic chemotherapy, to try to, both on the patients with, and particularly in patients with advanced disease. And so whether those trials are being done in a randomized fashion, or whether there's kind of single arm trials. I can't give you the specifics of those.
Well, thank you so much for that. And actually, that would lead us to another question that I would have. And certainly to preface, we do have matching services on our website where patients can go on to www.demystream.org and see our clinical trials matching service where they can create a profile or look at open trials, because I know you have referenced that different institutions or locations might have different trials available. But what are some other ways that people can learn about clinical trials, find different trials within the U.S. or maybe even outside the U.S.?
We don't have a well-defined way to do that. Obviously, your website can do that matching. The NIH website, trials.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, I don't know the exact link, but that can be a source for identifying those. And then I think that often, in order to have it somewhat filtered, you need to hopefully have a confidence with your provider, your oncologist, to be able to ask that question. I encourage everyone at any stage they are, even from the earliest of the prevention or family history. If you're at risk for stomach cancer, there may even be trials at that very early stage, up to the point of even those individuals that have stage 4 disease, in which the typical standard regimens have been tried and are no longer effective, and that's a so-called phase 1, which is in trials in which newer agents may be tested, and those are trials in which it's a so-called single arm. It's not a randomized trial, in which the main goal of the trial, candidly, is to look for safety, feasibility and safety of the most novel agent in a phase 1 study, but with a hope that it often may offer an opportunity to be effective. Those are the most experimental trials. So just to kind of back up about the types of trials, so a phase 1 trial is really the first when a let's say a drug, for example, or new therapy is identified as potentially effective based on preclinical studies. And again, a new agent may be tested in preclinical animal studies and other studies to demonstrate potential effectiveness and likely to be safe. Then when the trial is first brought out in human clinical trials, it's typically a new agent, or sometimes combination, but typically new agent is brought into the clinical trial arena as a phase 1, where it's very early, and it's the main goal of the study is to see whether it's safe and feasible to administer to patients. So those trials are usually small number of patients. It's a single arm, meaning just a single group. Often it's not just stomach cancer or just pancreas cancer or just breast cancer, but it may be open to a variety of types of cancer. The goal is, sometimes patients are a little bit frustrated with this, because it's often, again, the goal is just to see whether it's tolerated and safe, and so often there can be a dose escalation, if you will, where the dose can be starting out very, very small, and groups of patients are with increasing doses. So if you're early on in a phase 1 trial, for example, it may be a very low dose, something that patients likely would be tolerated, but sometimes patients are wondering, wait a minute, if I'm going to go on this trial, why am I just here being tested for safety, when in fact they want the maximum effect of it. But that's a so-called phase 1 trial, and it depends. Again, and those are typically can be often dose escalation, single arm, fairly small studies. The goal is not to really demonstrate that it's effective or not in patients, and can be in multiple tumor types. The phase 2 studies are studies to look at some signal of effectiveness, and those can be either a so-called single-arm phase 2, where you're showing in either phase 1 or that it's safe, and now you're going to test it, and still in a relatively small number of patients typically, to look at whether there's some signal of effectiveness. And often in those then can be given as a single arm, where it's you just compare it to prior patients that didn't get the therapy. It's a so-called historic controls, and that's often fraught with potential problems in demonstrating its effectiveness. So it may be 50, 60 patients, and for example, on the study, you're just going to try those patients with that new agent or new regimen, and then you compare it to prior patients or to the literature that suggest, and to see whether it's better or not. Again, it's not very rigorous, but it can be effective in telling a pretty strong signal of effectiveness. There is a so-called randomized phase 2, where one can randomize two groups of patients to kind of the standard versus the experimental group in a phase 2 study. But those are typically still small number of patients, where the goal is not to really statistically compare the effectiveness of the two groups, but just to look at the group as a whole, but also maybe to see whether there's at least a signal or a sense of that one group may be better than the other. That's a so-called randomized phase 2 design. If something is wildly successful or effective, then one could potentially get at least a sense of a signal that one group, that the experimental group, may be better in a randomized phase 2. But the study design, the number of patients, is not designed to really look at effectiveness of one group versus the other in a rigorous way. That's really reserved for the so-called phase 3 trial, which is truly a randomized trial of comparing two groups, typically a control group to an experimental group, in which the study is powered. That is, the number of patients are structured in such a way that if successful, that it's demonstrating effect, that one group is more effective than the control group. And that's really classically the more of the gold standard to determine the effectiveness of therapy, and often in most cases based on a randomized phase 3 trial, in which, for example, if designed properly, that the FDA may require or look at to determine whether a new agent, for example, then may or may not be approved for use.
Thank you. And there is a question coming in regarding phase 3 trials. Is it true that phase 3 clinical trials may contain the latest cutting-edge therapies that is available for stomach cancer patients?
The phase 3 may contain the latest cutting edge. It is the well, one can look at it either way. I mean, you could argue that the most potential, the earlier the phase 1 or the phase 2 trials may be more likely to have something even more cutting edge, but on the other hand, it's more unproven. So, or less. So a phase 3 trial is a trial in which the real question is being studied: is this better? Is this more effective? So a little bit hard to say whether indeed is it the phase 3 that's going to be the one that has the most cutting edge, but it's probably the one where one is really asking whether that regimen or that agent is going to really work. Some have argued that it's the phase 3 that are often larger numbers of patients in which it's not always where the most effective but completely unknown cutting-edge therapy may be initially being looked at, or even phase 1 for that matter. But that's really, phase 1 is a complete unknown as to whether, so there you may be getting what could be potentially the first look at something that could be the most cutting edge, but on the other hand, it's less perhaps less likely to be effective, both because it's completely unknown with regard to its efficacy. It's kind of more of a long shot, and also even the dose, as I mentioned, is even not necessarily yet optimized, for example. So you're kind of both ways. But a phase 3 trial, I would say, may be the most likely to get something that may be the closest cutting edge to if that trial is indeed proven to be effective.
And if a trial is showing negative or coming up with negative results, is it possible that drug could still be beneficial for stomach cancer patients or possibly another subset of patients? And if so, are they able to still receive that treatment?
That's a very good question. In fact, that is exactly the case. That is, unless it's depending on how the trial is designed, typically if a study does not show that it's statistically significantly beneficial, does not, in fact, mean that it's not effective. It just means it hasn't been proven to be effective. And that's actually quite a big difference, because it all depends on the trial and the patient number. And then there's even the opposite is that the trial can show that it's statistically significant, but it's not clinically relevant. It's not clinically. So if you have a trial, for example, with large enough patients and it shows a 2-week prolongation in survival, okay, it's statistically better, but I mean, on average, it's only 2 weeks of it's not really, may for example, not be necessarily that clinically relevant. On the other hand, it could be that a trial may not show statistically significant effectiveness, a positive trial, and yet that agent may be very effective for stomach cancer, or more importantly, may be effective for you, that individual with stomach cancer. And that is part of the real challenge, and that is that these studies are designed to look at the efficacy in a population, typically a large population. And as we know, the direction that particular cancer therapy and stomach cancer is going is that we're moving toward a more of a personalized direction where stomach cancer is not one cancer. It's a family of different biologies based on often, or could be based on their different molecular profiles. And so if one thinks about it, if you do a trial in which you're looking at all stomach cancers, but you happen to have a subset that may make up only a few % of the whole group, but that subset may be that therapy that you're on, that trial that drug is highly effective for that very small subset, but it will not be demonstrated in that trial where there's more of a homogeneous, non-selected group of patients into the trial. And so that is a big challenge. What's being done in that situation, as one can imagine, let's say if you have, for example, some molecular alteration of stomach cancer that only makes up 5 or 6%, let's say, of the entire population of stomach cancer, how will you know whether that given therapy, if it's studied in all 100 patients, but it's only effective in that 5 or 6%, you will never see it in that randomized trial. Plus, to put hundreds or sometimes thousands of patients on that large unselected trial would be is a lot of effort and expense. So how we're dealing with that is a real challenge in stomach cancer, in looking at studies in stomach cancer, because we're learning that there are different molecular subtypes. We know, for example, there are different mutational analysis. HER2/neu is one example where it's a small subset of patients with stomach cancer in which therapies such as Herceptin is maybe more effective. That's one example, but there are many more emerging of different subsets of selected subtypes. One can take that large trial, and the way people have determined that is looking at, in retrospect, saying, okay, you take all those thousands of patients, and then you, in retrospect, look at them and say, oh, that's 6% that have this different phenotype or the different mutation type seems to be in a subsequent subset analysis, you may be able to determine that, okay, the trial overall wasn't beneficial, but in this subset it was beneficial. That's one way to do it. And you don't always detect that because you may not have enough patients of that subset. The other way is to study it in a phase 2 design, in which you, or even the problem is if you're trying to do a large randomized trial of that small subset, then you can imagine the logistics of trying to identify and do molecular testing, and then try to do a randomized trial of that small subset of patients with stomach cancer. So bottom line is that as we're getting more personalized, the current ways we do clinical trials, and particularly randomized phase 3 trials, are becoming more and more difficult. But it's becoming more and more difficult to identify effective therapies in smaller and smaller subsets. And so a lot of the leaders who are conducting clinical trials in stomach cancer and other malignancies are attempting to devise new ways of designing trials in which one can do these subset trials. It's been done in breast cancer. There's a trial design called the I-SPY or I-SPY 2, in which there are different subsets, and patients are randomized into different buckets depending on their molecular profile. It's being looked at in colon cancer and in others. Lung cancer, it has not yet. We don't have an ongoing trial design like that in stomach cancer, but that likely will be the direction it's going to go in the future.
Thank you so much for that explanation. And as we are closing on the end time for our webinar, I just would like to see if you had any additional closing comments.
Well, again, I would like to thank you for participating, and I do think this is all of you are, particularly those that are battling this disease, are really the heroes in this, and both the challenges of dealing with this difficult problem, but also that patients that are the ones that participate in the clinical trials are really the heroes, because that is really how we can move the field forward. So I do encourage all of you, for the reasons I mentioned, to make sure to explore not just those individuals who have advanced disease and who are looking for whatever options, but at any level there may be opportunities to be a participant in a clinical trial. And you need to always ask that question, avail yourselves of a trial, whether it's a randomized phase 3 trial or whether it's the phase 1 exploratory trial, or even a biomarker or imaging trial. Those are all, they can help you as an individual, but also help us try to lick this terrible disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choti, for sharing this information with us and for your time today. We are going to close the webinar, and appreciate everyone for sending in their questions as well. As you know, this webinar was brought to you by Debbie's Dream Foundation, Curing Stomach Cancer. Thank you to Debbie Zellman, President and Founder, our speaker, Dr. Michael Choti of University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, and to Genentech for providing funding that helped make this webinar possible. As you can see on your screen, we have upcoming events to get involved in and support. Details about these events are available on the Debbie's Dream website at www.debbiesdream.org. Thank you again to all of our listeners and speakers today. Our next clinical trials webinar will be held on September 2nd at 12:45 Eastern Time. We would love to hear your feedback, questions, and thoughts before then. Please send your comments to patient.resource@debbiesdream.org. Thank you for joining us.